So I have compiled this video in an attempt to make my position on the historical Jesus, which is agnosticism, known to those in this discussion, and why I feel that taking any hardline position towards historicity is problematic. Since I have only a brief amount of time to work with, mainly because Joel is an evil, evil man who allots only a fraction of the time necessary to argue and defend positions as complex as these, I am forced to limit the scope of this video. Though, if anyone wants to examine my position on this question in more detail, they are welcome to go to my blog, which I will post up at the end of this discussion. Now, let's get started. Concerning my methods, I've decided to analyze one side of the argument, as I have come down rather hard on mythicists lately. So this video will argue that doubting the historicity of the figure of Jesus, rather than arguing that Jesus didn't exist, which I don't believe is a viable argument as it is an acceptable position to take and one that I feel needs more consideration within the academic community. The first argument, which is typical among historical Jesus scholars, is the criterion of embarrassment. Essentially, the argument is made that crucifixion was just too embarrassing to be tied to a mythical figure, ergo the Easter tradition is based upon an actual historical crucifixion that had become embellished as to save it. But this criterion is wildly problematic. The concept behind this criterion alone is ridiculous, since we know that people in antiquity believed in all sorts of embarrassing traditions associated with their many deities. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of high esteem, was stripped naked and crucified and eventually died. Anatolians worshipped Attis, and their priests ritually castrated themselves as a means to follow in the embarrassing tradition of their god, who had castrated himself in a bit of madness. Castration was more embarrassing than crucifixion to the Roman elite, and Seneca had a few choice words to say about it. Yet as embarrassing as that was, the Attis cult was extremely popular during the Roman period. On the same line of thought, those gods who, according to tradition, were humiliated and suffered and died, were also known to come back from the dead only to triumph and succeed, or be glorified. Inanna, for example, was resurrected by her father only to return and condemn Dumuzi, also known as Tammuz, the same god talked of in Ezekiel 8:14, to the underworld. So imagining a narrative where a Jewish prophet was crucified only to be redeemed later is not as far-fetched as some would have us believe. It certainly was not at all embarrassing for those believers who converted, and I doubt anyone was to argue that Attis was a real historical figure. Before moving on, I would like to stress that I'm not arguing for parallelism. That is, I'm not saying that the Jesus mythos derived from these other mythic traditions. Instead, and I want to stress this, I am arguing that the mentality to believe in this sort of mythos was not only acceptable, but common. Finally, we must remember that the Jewish people were expecting a humiliated savior figure. The evidence for this is staggering, and it is a shame that so many scholars, especially those who still cling to the criterion of embarrassment, fail to deal with it. Aside from Daniel 9, there is also a discussion in Wisdom 2-5, Isaiah 52-53, 1Q Isaiah A 52:13 to 53:12. And also there's 11Q13, 2:18-20, and so on. Now, on to the next. Some historical Jesus scholars argue that Christianity could not have sprung from the belief in the spiritual being first, who was later historicized. This isn't so, as we should all be well acquainted with Zalmoxis, who had a large following in Greece, but who even Herodotus doubted ever existed. And yet, he is attested by multiple sources, both Greek and Roman historians, throughout antiquity. Euhemerization was common in antiquity, and many historicized figures that never lived on Earth were known and believed. Their origins mattered little since they were localized deities. Even legendary founders of particular cities were historicized into the past, like Romulus, Lycurgus, possibly even Solomon and David. It is also known that many fictional stories became historicized, even within a few generations of the composition. Judith was originally written with the intent to educate, to be an edification narrative, which is what I believe the Gospels were meant to be. But Judith became widely believed to be a historical figure in the days of Clement of Rome and through late antiquity, and the narrative was accepted as history even by early church fathers and historians like Eusebius. Like the Gospels, the Book of Judith contains a genealogy. The opening containing the unhistorical information about Nebuchadnezzar and Holofernes was not written out of ignorance, but stated as a way for readers to recognize the book was not to be read as a history. The same might be said for Luke's Gospel and the placing of the census as well, but the strength of this argument cannot be made here in the short time we were given, which is also dangerously approaching its end. The same might be said for the ahistorical book of Esther, which Josephus summarizes, and the book of Tobit, which is still considered a historical work in the Catholic Church today, along with Judith. Again, I pause only to reiterate that I am not saying that the Gospels had to have been written about a fictional character. That would be silly. Of course, it is possible that the Gospels are fictional narratives written about a historical figure. In fact, the narratives might just be edifications, and could all be made up of nothing more than literary tropes and motifs. But that does not negate the possibility of a historical kernel behind them, and it is wrong to suggest otherwise. However, this is why doubting historicity and taking a position of agnosticism, or leaning towards the idea that Jesus never existed historically, is not something that is far-fetched. At least it's not as far-fetched as some would have you believe. It should be acceptable and more openly acknowledged. With that said, I must end my video, though I hope you did enjoy it. I realize it was not as detailed and comprehensive as it could have been. The question of historicity does not begin nor end with these points. The value of this question is in the merit of the evidence when looked at as a whole. As a consequence, I encourage readers to read my articles on the subject and the articles of other bibliobloggers like James McGrath and Neil Gottfried, if only to gain perspective on the debate.